their families across the country engaging with candidates for elected offices. I'd love for everyone, again, if you're just joining us now, to drop their names and organizations and locations in the chat so that we can get a sense of who's on the line with us. The meeting is being recorded, so if you have an issue with that, now's the time to jump off. But first, I want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to ask you all to please remain on mute to minimize the distractions during the webinar. We'll have some time at the end for questions, and at that point, we'll prompt you to come off mute and engage directly with our speakers, but it just helps everyone stay focused if we remain on mute when we're not speaking. And we're really eager to answer questions that you might have. So please drop them in the chat throughout the conversation. If we have a lot of questions that we don't get to, we certainly will follow up after the webinar by email with all the answers that are presented on the webinar. Let's get into what we'll be covering today. I really want to provide you with a brief overview of the toolkit we're launching today, including what you can expect to find within it and why it's so important for our movement to have been given right now, given the political context. We'll then hear from 4 expert speakers. I'm really excited to hear from them today. We'll discuss the legal considerations, the case studies from their own policy campaign efforts, polling and mobilizing guidance, and communications best practices. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session where you can ask questions and share your experiences. I know this goes without saying that the stakes of the upcoming 2024 election are higher than ever. Prenatal to 3 issues, from childcare to paid leave, maternal health to Head Start, are at an inflection point. As advocates, we have the ability to impact what happens to families across the country on the other side of this election. Our movement is strong enough to ensure every child has the strong start in life they deserve, starting with where the needs are greatest and with those communities most impacted by historic disinvestment and structural racism. But to do that really well and effectively, we have to engage with candidates before they're elected. And that's why we're here today and why we're launching a brand new toolkit, which we'll share at the end of this webinar. That's really packed with resources and guidance to provide all of us as advocates with the tools we need to understand why, when, and how to engage with candidates. This toolkit provides everything from how to write a question for candidates to an overview of the legal requirements to message-tested languages distilled into sharp, effective talking points. On core prenatal to 3 issues, advocates can have readily available for any and all communications with candidates. As a 501c3 organization, we really have significant opportunities to engage meaningfully and proactively in this space. I know some of our organizations are more nervous about this than others, but for our movement to grow in strength and power, we really need to seek out opportunities and be both smart and bold in our approach to advocacy. We know that if policymakers don't collectively take action to address the lack of investment in PN3 issues, young children and families will suffer. And that is why, as a movement, we really have to get this right. In an election year, getting it right really means mobilizing our members and those impacted by the policies we seek to change. It means engaging candidates on prenatal to 3 issues so they understand it's a priority for their constituents. We need to ask candidates the hard questions that get them thinking about the policy solutions they need to enact once they are in office. So more than 5,793 seats are up for election this year, representing 78% of the nation's legislative seats. In November of 2024, 44 states will conduct legislative elections. To make the most of these staggering opportunities, nonprofit organizations, coalitions, and individual advocates need to be sharp, persistent, and unified in the efforts to engage with candidates for public office. That's why we're so thankful for each of you for being here today, for your commitment to growing us all as a movement, and for the work you do every day to help support children and families. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce our first expert speaker, Alan Madison. Alan is a partner at Trista Ross Shadler and Gold. He helps nonprofit organizations like Voices for Healthy Kids and others to mitigate legal risk while maximizing their ability to advocate effectively for the public policy missions. If you're a member of the NCIT, you can access Alan and his expertise to the TA portal, but really want to thank you for joining us today and turn it over to Alan.
Thanks so much, Allison. I appreciate it. So the core thing I want to emphasize today is helping to folks to expand their comfort zone. That often 501c3 organizations are anxious about getting involved in elections because they understand that C3s are absolutely prohibited from showing any kind of a preference for or against any political candidate. But the bottom line is we still have a right to educate the public throughout the whole election season. And we have an important role to play to educate candidates and the public about our issues in an election because there's so much more attention being paid to policy issues during an election. So we have to walk carefully through these issues, but we have to recognize that it's something that's totally within the 501c3 wheelhouse. We just have to understand how to walk carefully so that we can engage really effectively in election seasons. So, and Andrea, if we can go to the next slide, there's a whole panoply of different things that 501c3s are allowed to do in elections. They're allowed to do voter reg, they're allowed to do get out the vote activities, educating the public through public statements about policy issues. We can keep advocating for policy issues throughout the whole election cycle. We just can't be tying those policy issues directly to praise for candidates for example, taking that policy issue as part of their platform. We can do candidate briefings, then we can do forums, debates, and other issues that all of the speakers on this call are going to be focusing on. The two things I want to focus on right now as we start off are get out the vote activities and candidate briefings, because they're two areas where C3s can really be effective and where we have a lot of room to work, but they often don't get the attention that people really focus on them enough. So Andrea, if we can go to the next slide. The reason I'm focusing on get out the vote activities is, first of all, it's a lot easier to conduct than voter registration activities. Voter registration activities are really important for C3s to do, but it's not for every C3. To do a voter registration drive, you, first of all, can't use foundation grants. And second of all, you have to comply with a whole bunch of very specific laws in your state about exactly how to conduct that voter registration drive. For get out the vote activities, on the other hand, there are very few legal restrictions on what you can do. The next slide, Andrea, can tell you what it is that we need to do to make our get out the vote activities safe. The first is it's got to be nonpartisan, meaning it doesn't support any candidate or party, but it just encourages people to get out and vote. It encourages participation and activation. And even building on the groups that have already done voter registration activities, GOTV ensures that those people actually cast a ballot. There's a huge gap between people registering and actually casting a ballot. We need to make sure that those people are doing them. When we're doing our messaging about GOTV, make sure to mention a panoply of issues. You don't want to just say, vote for a particular issue that aligns with one candidate and not the other, because that's going to be viewed as a proxy for saying to vote for that candidate. So you don't want to say, for example, vote for solutions to climate change, because in the presidential election, one candidate is pushing for climate change solutions and the other one isn't. That would be aligned with a particular candidate. But you can always say, vote for babies and toddlers, right? Vote for your kid's future. That doesn't align with any particular candidate. It's totally safe and it's going to motivate people to get out there and vote. And when we do our messaging, we want to be either targeting the whole public or targeting historically underrepresented communities. Women, youth voters, Black, Latino, any kind of population that's suffered historic discrimination and systemic obstacles to voting, C3s can target those communities specifically with our messaging. And data shows that parents of young children are among the groups that really don't get out and vote. Parents of young children face more obstacles to voting than a lot of people in the country because they're busy, they've got childcare pickups that they've got to manage. So it's really important to send GOTV messages out to folks who've got young children. Next slide, please. The other type of activity that I want to mention briefly are candidate briefings. So this is where you provide your information to all of the candidates for a particular office. You've got to make sure your information is going out to everyone in the office. So you often will provide materials on your issue to all the candidates running for a particular office and invite them to come in and say, hey, we'd love to come in and give you a briefing. It's totally fine if one candidate says, yes, I'd love to talk to you, and the other one says no. That's okay. We don't have to force someone to take our information. But to the extent that someone will allow us to come in and give a briefing on their issues, on our issues to them, is so valuable, especially at lower levels of government. So if you've got someone running for state house or state senate, or even city council, and you get in and talk to them about infant and child issues at the beginning of their political career, it's going to shape the way their entire political career goes. So it's going to have a lasting impact on their policy choices. And two, it's going to turn your organization into a valued spokesperson, a valued resource that they're going to keep coming back to throughout their whole political career. So it's a really powerful tactic that you can leverage, and it's totally fine for C3s to do. It's just part of your educational message and mission. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Allison.
At one point, I'll figure out my mute button, but thank you so much, Ellen. Really appreciated that. That's important information for our movement to have right now. And up next, we'll hear from an expert in the field, Avo Makdishian, I hope I got that right, the Executive Director Strategy Lead for the First Five Association of California. Welcome, Avo. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Allison, and good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the West Coast in California. Again, Avo Makdishian, representing the First Five Association of California. We represent the 58 county First Five commissions throughout the state of California that are charged with providing services and connections for families with young children birth through age 5. We were created through a tobacco tax in California back in 1998. And like I said, we are the association that represents all 58 county First Fives. I'm here to talk a little bit about how engaging candidates, particularly on specific policy issues, has worked in California, and would love to give some background on a campaign that I was a part of in my former role, and talk a little bit about some of the outcomes we're seeing from that campaign today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So just for some background for California, our previous governor, Jerry Brown, really did a lot for the state, especially in the K-12 arena, but in the early childhood arena, we saw significant cuts to programs and services to the tune of over $1 billion in a 5-year period. And at the time, California really ranked pretty low on many of the outcomes, population-based outcomes we like to see for young kids. Next slide, please. And so when I was working at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, one of the largest community foundations in the country, early childhood was a big priority for the foundation. And we thought, what can we do as a large foundation to ensure that the next governor of California prioritizes young children? Next slide, please. So we launched this initiative called Choose Children, and Choose Children had really 5 strategies, many of which are highlighted in the guide. And I know a couple of colleagues here, Joshua and Joseph, will be talking to some of these strategies, but I wanted to give the audience a little flavor of how we implemented our 5 strategies in California. And what I want to also pause and say is, even though we focused on the governor's race, which is the highest office in our state, these strategies really did apply to a lot of local races between 2018 and now. So I just want to emphasize that these strategies are absolutely, there's an ability to implement them at different jurisdictions. So quickly on our strategies, we focused on compiling research especially around polling. We developed and promoted a consensus policy agenda for candidates to review. and incorporate it into their campaigns. I'm going to spend a lot of time there. Hosted events, and we'll talk about here in a little bit. And also worked with media, both social and earned media, around placing the issue of early childhood within the context of a gubernatorial race. And then last but not least, I'll end with some of what we've tracked so far and the outcomes with our Choose Children campaign. Next slide, please. Quickly on the research, and I know Joseph will be going through a lot of polling data that I know they've been looking at. But in California, we really looked at asking the question of how the early childhood issue, played when voters thought about who their next governor should be. No surprise, voters, almost 9 out of 10 voters said that it's important for the next governor to prioritize young children. Next slide, please. And so knowing that, starting there, and I can get into some of the other polling that we did, but starting there, we decided how can we get our statewide advocates together to build a consensus policy agenda for the candidates to absorb and incorporate within their campaigns. And I gotta say, there's nothing like a deadline to get different groups together to focus on a consensus agenda, and that's exactly what happened with a race coming up, with an election coming up. So we really use that to get to consensus, and the 5 main areas listed here on the screen are familiar, I think, to everyone. But we honed in on paid leave, we honed in on childcare and workforce compensation. We honed in on universal preschool. We also talked about health and developmental services. And then finally, this overarching or undergirding policy of a well-developed infrastructure. So those were the 5-point plan that we gave to all the candidates. Next slide, please. And how we talked about these policy agenda. This policy agenda, as many of you know, candidates don't live and breathe early childhood policy every day. And so we gave them a forum to talk about any questions they had with the policy agenda, any responses they had to the polling that we did. And we did that through events and forums, as you can see here. Next slide, please. We also hosted a debate, a televised debate that also tried to place the issues of research, polling, and our policy agenda at the center of the debate. Next slide. And then we, as I talked about, really tried to place all of this information into the media coverage that was happening around the governor's race, both social and earned media. And you can see some of the headlines here, really focusing on the political reporters that were covering the race and sharing with them some of the data that we were uncovering. Next slide. And that's just an example of some of the interactions we had with candidates around the messaging we were putting on through social media. Next slide. And so I'll just end here with a couple of outcomes of the Choose Children campaign. The first is a narrative change outcome that I want to talk about. This is the Republican candidate who ran for governor, John Cox. His messaging and his narrative throughout the campaign changed significantly. And although he didn't win, a lot of our messaging was part of his campaign. As you can see here, some of his quotes, especially around early childhood education being important and essential. Next slide. And then one of the policy outcomes I wanted to highlight is Governor Newsom was elected in 2018, and his first budget after he was elected included $2 billion in early childhood programs. And so that was a big win for the entire community and the Choose Children campaign. I'll talk more about how we've been tracking Governor Newsom's investments and policies since 2018 and where we are today, but that hopefully gives you a flavor of how we started with this administration and where we're going in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Avo. That was amazing. it's so valuable to hear examples from actual work on the ground, particularly when they have the outcomes that you've seen so far. So congratulations on that, and looking forward to see what will happen in the next election. And for many of us, looking not just to 2024, but to 2026, when we have, over 30 governors up for election. So we'll all begin this for the long haul. Our next speaker is Joseph O'Hearn, the First 5 Years Funds Coalition and Campaign Manager, coordinating coalition activities and supporting legislative priorities through advocacy campaigns. Thanks for joining us today, Joseph. We're really excited to hear about some of the newest work you've been doing. Joseph.
Thanks. Hey, thanks for having us. Very excited to be here and share some of the new national polling that just came out of First 5 Years Fund. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So we tested, just to give you a little context, we spent the last couple of months, we did 6 focus groups across the country. We did 2 in Arizona, 2 in Nebraska, 2 in Philadelphia, to help inform a large national poll that we did that also oversampled some of the Senate swing states this year. And we did this poll to help provide insight into voter perceptions around childcare and early learning, and to help better inform lawmakers and candidates on how to talk about childcare and early learning on the trail, and to provide a resource to all of you. At the end of this, I'll drop a link to the handy 2-pager that we have developed on our website for the polling as well. So if you want to go to the next slide. So as you can see, voters today are just as likely as they were during the pandemic to say that Congress and President should prioritize quality childcare. One of the things that we've been able to do at First 5 Years Fund is do this polling pretty regularly, and we've been able to track year over year, cycle over cycle, how people feel about childcare. And we've been able to see clearly that even it wasn't just kind of a pandemic bubble or a pandemic interest, people are still prioritizing childcare and quality early learning from their lawmakers. We've seen, if you want to go to the next slide, that they also understand how important it is for candidates to have a plan. And we've been asking this question pretty regularly as well. One of the big takeaways for us out of this polling was how clear it was that voters really want candidates to have a plan about this issue, to engage on this issue, even if it is not the most talked about issue in the news day in and day out. Voters understand how important this issue is. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see that this is true across all those subgroups that matter to candidates. You can see very clearly, even with Republican voters, you're getting a plurality of people that are saying that it is essential or very important for candidates to have a plan. And you're seeing an overwhelming majority giving it a somewhat or very important rating. And you can see that even with suburban voters, Trump voters, Biden voters across the board, this issue is important to voters to say candidates have a plan. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see that voters have also internalized the need for increased federal funding. This is obviously a very important data point for us as First 5 Years Fund, as we do federally focused lobbying efforts and advocacy efforts on the Hill, but having that clear majority of people that want increased funding. And we're seeing that, again, year over year, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic, we're seeing that increased support, a little uptick. I think we're just outside the margin, so I'm allowed to say that it's a statistically significant increase, but seeing good year over year increase in support for federal funding. So if you want to go to the next slide. So what we've done now is tested some of the solutions and some of the federal policy solutions that we advocate for here on the Hill. We know based on the previous polling that we've had a lot of success, and it's largely due to a lot of the work that advocates like all of you on this call have been doing, that voters have internalized. It's important for candidates to have a plan. It's an important issue for candidates and elected officials, and they've internalized that it's important and its impacts on the economy and quality early learning. And again, a lot of that kind of internalized messaging with voters has really been done to the year over year work that you all have done. So we wanted to get into solutions and what we think we can advocate for on the Hill. So if you want to go to the next slide. As you all know, the block grant program is one of the main ways in which the federal government provides funding to states to provide childcare and early learning to low-income families. One of the big proposals is obviously to expand that program, definitely, and you can see the exact wording there of how we put it in the italics, but expand that program and specifically on a sliding scale, provide more support to middle-income families. One of the things we saw over and over again in our focus groups was folks in the middle feeling left out from these supports and investments. So in testing this proposal, we saw very clearly that voters are very supportive of it. In fact, seeing a number like 44% strongly support a federal proposal that you're testing in today's climate is pretty great. Seeing it hit 85 overall support means that we are getting support from every demographic subgroup you could imagine. You don't get to 85 without having pretty unanimous consent. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that, again, this is very true. Even for Trump voters, hitting 75%, 33 strongly support this proposal. Pretty much no opposition to it is a great talking point to show the strong bipartisan support for childcare and early learning. And you've seen the near unanimous support again from Biden voters. If you want to go to the next slide, which is my favorite, this is one we love to show to candidates and elected officials, that over 4/5 of voters would be more likely to vote for a candidate who supports this proposal. So we like to make it very clear that not only is this a popular decision or popular policy proposal, but this is one that voters want their candidates and elected officials to support. You're seeing that both nationally and across those Senate swing states that we oversampled. So if you want to go to the next slide. Some of the other proposals we also tested are around the tax space that I'm adding just because in 2025, we know there's going to be a lot of talk about taxes one way or the other in the new Congress. And so we want to make sure childcare is part of that conversation. We're doing everything we can to make sure that we're increasing ways in which we can provide support and affordable quality childcare to working families. So one of the things we tested was the CDCTC. We do a lot of work making sure it's not confused with the very important CTC, but this is the tax credit designed specifically for childcare. And this is also a place where we actually put in hard numbers of how much things cost. As you can see in the italics at the bottom, we talked about increasing the average of this tax credit from $600 to $4,000 per child. And that was, again, a hugely popular policy proposal. You're not getting to 76% unless you've got support across all the subgroups. If you want to go to the next slide, you can see that both Biden and Trump voters support increasing the CDCTC. Again, breaking 60% with Trump voters and hitting 90% with Biden voters. This is a very popular proposal and idea. So the next, if you want to go to the next slide, the next thing we did in our polling, besides testing some of these policy proposals and thoughts and feelings around childcare and early learning, is we specifically tested some messaging. And we did this through our focus groups that better helped inform our polling. And we did what's called a max diff analysis. So what we did is we provided a bunch of different, I think it was over 15 different messages pertaining to childcare and early learning to motivate people to get them interested or care about childcare and early learning, especially as it pertains to their federal elected officials. And the way it works is basically people get the option to rank order so that we can really see which policy or which proposals, which message statements were the most persuasive or most effective to voters. So if you want to go to the next slide. These are the ones that pop the most for us. The way to look at something like a max diff is anything with a score over 100 is above average persuasiveness, which means it is more persuasive than the other messages we tested. And we saw some very clear themes develop. Now you can see on the screen all the different messages that we specifically tested and their wording. But the themes that we saw were, again, because of all the hard work that all of you have done over the years, that the foundational message and how important it is for early learning is really, really important for children, and people have internalized how important it is to make sure children have that early childhood education. So that foundation of a house messaging really popped. And we saw cost messaging pop, but only as it was related to tying that very specific impact that families were feeling. In this case, it was debt. We did test messages that were pointing out, how much childcare costs on average per year for families. We did test messages around that very specific cost or even relating it to things like it costing as much as 4-year college degree. That type of messaging, which I know a lot of us have used in the past, did not pop as much in this polling. Rather, it was very much tying that cost to families going into debt that really stuck out. And then we saw that same cost and how it impacts the economy also popping. And lastly, especially as it really pertains to quality, some of that messaging around teachers being paid adequately really popped as people internalized the need for that quality early childhood education. If you go to the next slide, you can see just between some of the different subgroups, which messages did the best. Again, that foundation of a house really did well for independents and Democrats. And for Republicans, it was the foundation of a house. While it was the second top message, the one that popped the most was how lack of quality care impacts people's ability to get to work and having fewer work days. So sometimes as we're talking to different audiences, it can be important to have that delimitation. If you want to go to the next slide. And then you can see again, we broke this out by parents with kids under 5, parents, kids 6 to 7, or no kids at home. I think it's really telling that no kids at home, that foundation of a house message really popped, even for people without young children or children under 18. We saw in our focus groups some pretty overt statements from voters on how important it was and how much they were willing to support their tax dollars in making sure children have that early childhood education because of the overall societal benefits. If you go to the next slide, you can see just some of the bottom lines here. Voters see expanding access to quality childcare is very important to the economy. It's incredibly important that message has been internalized, and is a great talking point when dealing with candidates and elected officials. Voters understand the impacts and really understand the impacts of lack of children's development, as well as how it impacts the families. They want to see increased funding to the states. They want to see the tax credits that help families afford quality childcare. They want candidates to have that plan, and they understand that the messages that support those type of policies or those type of reasons why quality childcare is important are the ones that obviously pop the most with voters. So I'm happy I'll drop some links in the chat so that folks can have the easy downloadable 2-pager, as well as, if anyone's interested, the full deck that has a lot of the messaging in there. But that's what I have for you today. Appreciate you all taking the time to hear from us.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate it. It's incredible for us to have access to these kinds of resources. I'm excited that you'll be sharing some of the things people can access in the chat. And just so people know, on the Toolkit website too, we'll be able to lead you right to Joe's website and downloading the information that you need from there too. So thank you so much. Next up is my colleague at Voices for Healthy Kids and NCIT, Joshua Harris. He's the Senior Communications Manager. Joshua has more than a decade of experience in government relations and communications work. And so we're really glad to hear from him today. So welcome, Josh, and thanks for speaking for us today.
No problem. Thank you so much. And you guys have gotten a ton of information so far that's really been great. And so I'm excited to join you all. Again, my name is Joshua Harris, a Senior Manager of Marketing Communications for the NCIT, National Club of Infants and Toddlers. And I want to talk to you all today about how communications can be used as a powerful tool to engage candidates that are running for public office. You know, as advocates for infants, toddlers, and pregnant women and their families, we have to learn as a movement how we communicate our priorities effectively to ensure that our issues remain at the forefront on a candidate's agenda. These aren't issues that every candidate will prioritize without us putting the effort to ensure that happens. And so should these candidates be elected, where they stand as candidates on prenatal to 3 policy issues will have significant impact on the future of America and all of our communities. So we want to get ahead of the curve and start early on engaging them around our issues. And so next, oh no, here, sorry, this is the right slide. Where and how to engage candidates. Engaging with candidates is all about strategy. To maximize their impact, we need to meet candidates where they are, both physically and in terms of their current understanding of our issues. In this case, being a part of being an advocate is also requires us being educators. When people think about communications, the media oftentimes comes to mind. While the media is important to leverage and specifically earned media, advocates have a wide variety of spaces, platforms, and tactics at their disposal to communicate with candidates. And some of those are examples like town halls and public meetings or events. Those are prime opportunities for us to pose questions and bring issues to candidates' attention. Prepare your questions in advance, ensuring that they are specific and related to a candidate's potential action should they become elected. Social media is another example. Candidates are increasingly active on social media because they kind of have to be. And so utilize those spaces to ask questions and share information. Tag a candidate and use hashtags related to our issues to increase visibility. It's really easy to touch candidates on social media or to organize messaging campaigns around social media. Site visits. So you can invite candidates to visit a local childcare center or early Head Start classroom or health clinics. Those visits can be powerful and tangible ways to demonstrate the importance of our issues, and it creates a direct point of contact. And when someone is campaigning, they want to engage as many of their potential constituents as possible. And so while they're on the campaign trail, it's a prime opportunity to introduce them to our issues. Next slide. Crafting effective questions and being prepared. One way to engage candidates in all of these spaces is to be able to ask smart questions. Asking questions can be a valuable way to secure a commitment to an action from a candidate, which allows you to pressure them to stick to that commitment should they become elected or during their campaign. And so crafting questions that engage candidates effectively requires a mix of research, specificity, and clarity. A few things to keep in mind when developing those questions is to, number one, do your research. Review a candidate's website, their previous statements and voting records if they have one, if they've been elected before, and understand their position on your issues. And if they have one, they may not have one. And this will help you to tailor your questions to their specific position. Being specific, avoid vague language. Instead, ask very detailed questions that require a candidate to provide a clear stance. For an example, the difference between asking, do you support child care? Ask, what specific actions will you take to expand access to affordable child care for low-income families, right? And be able to be a good listener, because part of the art of being a politician is to answer a question without really answering, right? So there's a difference between saying that I believe that all families deserve affordable child care, right? Versus saying, not only do I believe that all families deserve affordable child care, but this is what I plan to do if elected to make sure that that happens, right? Listen for those specifics in the answers to those questions, as well as be specific in your questions. And then, of course, localize your questions. As many of you have likely heard, all politics is local, and candidates and elected officials are very aware that people in their district are the ones with the power to vote them in and out of office. So make sure you always highlight the local impact on those voters. Mention if you are or will be a constituent, if your child care center is in their district, and how the issue affects their constituency directly to make it more relevant and a pressing issue for the specific candidate. They pay attention to who is in their districts. They know who can vote them in and out of office. Next slide. Engaging in public settings. It's very important to consider who else has visibility into your conversation with candidates and the questions you ask them. Engaging candidates in public can create a ripple effect, influencing both the candidate as well as constituents or audience members to apply more pressures if they agree about your issue or they heard a candidate make a specific commitment. And so it's really important to do this because you don't want to have a situation where a candidate had a one-on-one meeting with you and said something, and then they're on the stage in front of 1,000 people and say, "Oh, I never said this," or you ask the question again. You want to be able to hold them accountable, and you want there to be witnesses that of what they said specifically that their commitment was. And so it's extremely great opportunity to be able to ask these questions in front of people and be able to secure essentially a public commitment to doing something or to not doing something. To say that they won't make cuts, right? It's very helpful to have that done in front of an audience or in front of individuals to where it's not just one person. Even if we're talking about a one-on-one meeting, not a one-on-one meeting, but a group meeting with you and a few other advocates, 4 or 5 people, to have a note taker and say, do a follow-up afterwards and say, thank you so much for meeting with us. Thank you for your commitment to X, Y, and Z, so that you have that on the record with not just yourself, but there are others present as well. And when asking questions in a public setting, there are a few things that you're going to want to do. One, identify yourself clearly and your organization. Mention if you are a constituent, as candidates are more likely to engage with voters from their district. Or if you have a question that you can give to a constituent, that's very helpful. You may have a constituent on your team who can ask that question on behalf of you or your organization, and that's much more helpful. Use personal stories, share personal or community stories that illustrate the importance of the issue, and it humanizes the problem and makes it much more relatable to any candidate to be able to touch someone who's experienced this or hear from someone that's experienced the impact on this issue. And then remember to stay nonpartisan. Remember 501c3 organizations, we have to remain nonpartisan, so focus on the issue, not the candidate or political party. This ensures that you stay within IRS guidelines and are able to maintain your credibility as an organization. And so then finally, monitoring and follow-up and accountability. Those are important. Next slide, please. So now that we've discussed why and how, I'm sorry, I guess this was on a previous slide. I think I included it. Sorry, Andrea. The last thing, monitoring and accountability and follow-up. Now that we've discussed why and how and where to ask these questions, it's important to note that the work doesn't stop there. Now we've got the candidate on the record, we've begun to build a relationship. It doesn't just end with asking questions or hosting a site visit or a meeting, introductory meeting with the candidate. Follow-up is critical to holding candidates accountable for following through consistently on commitments to our infants, toddlers, and their families. Whenever possible, make sure to document, I mentioned that earlier, and share a candidate's response. It's the reason that organizations will do candidate questionnaires so that they have a candidate's response on the record. Use multiple channels for candidate follow-up. Follow up with the candidate via email or social media, thank them for their responses and reiterate your key points. That reinforces issues of importance and keeps it on their radar. And then monitor their progress. If they've made changes in their messaging or updates to their website, or if elected, what steps they're taking towards their commitment. And engage them regularly to remind them of the commitments that they made to you while they were on the campaign trail. It's extremely important to follow up and stay at the forefront of this. And what you're doing by engaging them when they're candidates is important because relationships matter and you can become an early ally of theirs, whether they win or lose, because they're clearly leaders, someone who's been willing to step up and put themselves at the forefront to run for public office. And so as you as leaders and advocates, you want to consider having a quality relationship with them, particularly if they get elected, but even if they don't, because they can become allies in your messaging. And that means that because you've engaged them early, that means that they're more likely to support legislation from someone that's actually met with them, talked to them, educated them about the importance of an issue or the challenges and opportunities. in the PN3 space. And a critical component to that relationship is to be sure to listen. Legislators and candidates want to feel heard and valued, but then you have that relationship because you've engaged them early. And so the bottom line is that it's not uncommon for federal, state, and local elected leaders to lack a strong understanding of our prenatal to 3 policy needs. And we don't need them to be experts, but we need them to care and to know who their local experts are. And decision makers at all levels need to know that the PN3 issues impact all of their constituents, regardless of their political affiliation. And so by engaging with candidates and newly elected leaders, we can help to make them progress on and more effectively serve all of the families that they represent. And so effective communication with candidates requires preparation, strategic engagement, and persistent follow-up. By asking smart, specific questions and creating meaningful interactions, we can ensure that the needs of infants, toddlers, pregnant women, and their families are prioritized both on the campaign trail and once in elected office. And so with that, if we are effective communicators, we can make sure that every child has a strong start in life that they deserve by communicating early and often with our candidates and elected officials. Next slide. I did put that for questions and stuff, but I'm not sure if that's what we want to do. Allison, are we going to Q&A now?
Thanks so much, Joshua. I'm just going to give I really appreciate that, and love all those tips, and they're all in the toolkit as well. So I encourage people to look through that once they get the link. I'm going to turn it briefly over to Alan to see if there's anything after he heard all the presentations, if there's anything he wants to clarify or emphasize for the group.
No, I think that everyone encouraged folks to be really effective and forceful with their advocacy and with pushing forward and engaging in elections. I do want to mention that as you're asking candidates for their positions, it's so important to ask candidates, what are their positions, get them on the record. There's an important distinction to be made where we can't ask candidates to take a pledge to support our organization's issues per se. So, because that would be a tacit endorsement if we're saying, do you support this specific policy that's supported by our organization? That would be viewed as a candidate endorsement. But everything Joshua was saying about getting candidates, asking them nonpartisan questions, asking them the questions that the other speakers on the call have talked about policy issues, are exactly what folks should be doing. We have a question in the chat from Brenda asking if C3s can use candidate questionnaires and what tips people have for that. If you're going to ask all the candidates, candidate questionnaire is just asking all the candidates, hey, here's a panoply of questions, what's your position on them? And then providing to the public answers that all of the candidates prepared. There are a couple of key issues to do on a candidate questionnaire. One is, don't just do yes or no answers, because those yes or no answers are likely to align specifically with your organization's topics. It needs to be open-ended questions so that candidates are asking and sharing their views, so that it's not strictly aligned with whether or not they're aligned with the organization. And two, on a candidate questionnaire is ask a variety of issues. If your questions on a candidate questionnaire are very narrowly focused, then it's more likely to be specifically just aligned with your organization, as opposed to if you ask a breadth of issues about early child care, you're asking about nutrition, you're asking about paid leave, then you're asking a whole series of different questions and getting a variety of different answers from candidates. That's going to be great from the IRS perspective. And the last is, you can't selectively edit it. You need to provide their answers. So say, for example, in 500 characters, present your position on X issue, and then you reprint the entirety of that candidate's answer.
That's great, Alan. Thanks so much. So I just put in the box, please raise your hand if you have a question and we can call on you, or feel free to add them to the chat box. We have a few more minutes for questions. Someone texted me a question here. which of the candidates' team members are most important to connect with? Are there certain positions on a candidate's team that matter more than others? And I'm wondering, Avo, if you have any experience with that in the work in California.
Yeah, certainly the campaign manager and the candidate themselves, especially if you're working in a primary atmosphere, that getting closer to the candidate themselves is much easier to do, given the field is so big. So that was our experience in California. We worked directly with the folks who could get us access directly to the candidates themselves, primarily because we were working in the primary timeline.
Awesome, thank you.
If I can add to that, I'd like to say as well, the comms person. It's extremely important because they're the one who helps them to develop that message. They're the one drafting press releases. They're the one working on talking points. And so having that relationship with the comms person. But overall, you really don't know which campaign staffer will be the most critical. So if you have an opportunity to engage any of them, more than likely, these are the folks who will go on to be in staff positions in some way. So building those relationships are sometimes, in my experience, can be more important than actually with the candidate because the candidate is moving 100 miles an hour. And so the people who are briefing them are the staff and the ones who are saying, here's the talking points, here's what you should say about this, here's what's in this briefing, here's what's in this policy that you need to know about that's important is the staff. They're the ones reading, reviewing, and I tell folks who do federal advocacy all the time, our country is literally run by 25 to 35-year-olds because that's who's briefing all of our members of Congress who are writing the policies, who are doing all of the talking points for them. And I don't know that people realize that.
That's a really good point, Joshua. And I think those staffers get younger every time I go up on the Hill. It's not me getting older. It's definitely them getting younger. But one question for you, Joshua, too. Does a candidate's political party impact how we should engage with them on our issues? For example, are there some tactics that Republicans respond better to than Democrats?
Absolutely. And I think that it's important, as I mentioned, to do your research, right? To understand your candidate's values. And we actually have a great training that we do on understanding conservative lawmakers specifically. And it's called our conservative archetypes training and how you can use non-polarizing communication to understand their overall value system. But it is definitely important to do your research and understand where that candidate's background is, where they come from, and what things they value, what things may be potential triggers, right? You can say something in multiple ways. And so knowing how to address how you frame your issue is important to when engaging those candidates. And that only comes from doing your research and knowing your audience.
Great, I'm going to put a link to that.
Sorry, go
yes,
ahead.
go. I'm going to put a
really,
link to that guide, but go ahead, Avo.
Yeah, just really quickly, just to double down on what Joshua said, if you're able to do, I would say some more sophisticated, deeper dive polling, one thing we did in California is we looked at the candidates and their primary issues, their top issues, and we tried to connect polling questions between their top issues and the early childhood issue. For example, some candidates' top issue was public safety. And so we had polling questions that said something like, if a candidate's top issue is public safety, should they also be prioritizing investments in prevention and early intervention for young children? And showing that to the candidates so that they can play off their primary issues as a secondary issue around early childhood was also effective. And that I think that's a great part about the early childhood space is we can connect it to many issues across the board.
Very well said, and super important. Thank you so much for that. And so we're going to end with that great answer, but just a couple things we're going to put into the chat box, the link to the toolkit. Please reach out. We're happy to do additional trainings or connect with you or provide any services that you all need. We're excited for that. We want to hear feedback about this. This is just the start of the release of tools. We'll be releasing tools throughout the year through November that people can use during the election for communicating with candidates. But I'm also going to just really beg you to fill out this brief post survey that's popping up on your box. on your computer right now. It's super important for us to make sure that we are getting you the information that you need and we know where to go in the future for training. So if you could take a second to do that before you log off. And then I just want to thank you again and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. We'll keep this open for a few minutes so that people can get in here and respond both to the survey and to download the links that will be popping up in your chat box right now. Thanks again, and thanks for